Hi, my name is Taija Kontinen Sharp. I am the new resident coordinator in Lesotho.
And thank you very much for speaking with us for this interview. And so far, how have you found Lesotho since you arrived, and what impressions have you formed about the country so far?
Well, I think Lesotho has been a surprise in many ways. I had prepared for this assignment for months, in fact, because I knew I was coming here. And nothing quite prepares you for landing in a country that is within another country, but has a very distinct culture, traditions, national pride. It's been really interesting for the first few weeks to understand the country and really be here. And of course, the natural beauty is striking. I don't need to emphasize that. But what's also been very striking is the conversations with ordinary people. So understanding how people are looking for jobs, surviving with not a lot of safety nets, but still doing so with incredible resilience and incredible amounts of pride. So that's been really wonderful to see. And I think it also really resonates with the UN's mandate and with what we have to deliver here as the UN in support of the government and, of course, in service of the people of the country.
Speaking of the culture and the tradition and the beauty nature of the country, what do you think the country can potentially become a tourism destination?
Well, I just spent Easter up in Semonkong, riding with my family and visiting the waterfalls, seeing some of the villages up there. And in my view, Lesotho has a huge amount of potential for tourism. I would say sustainable ecotourism that also gives back to the community, helps communities in their development and in their attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. But there's a lot this country has to offer on its own to visitors like myself. Of course, I'm here for a longer term. I'm not a visitor for weeks and months, but rather years. But yes, there's a huge amount of potential, and I hope that it's developed in a way that people really see the stunning beauty of the country.
What are the key priorities and goals during your tenure as UN resident coordinator in Lesotho?
Well, I think that I've only been here for 1 month. That's 4 weeks. So it's too early to say what my priorities are. My priority is in some ways to listen before I lead. So to listen to the government, listen to the communities, listen to civil society, listen to my own UN team, many of who have been here a lot longer than I have. And so that when I do have priorities, there'll be ones that are really grounded in the reality of the country. But of course, the agenda is already clear. The government has a very strong national vision around youth unemployment, around jobs, around economic development, security, health, nutrition. So those are the issues that we as the UN, of course, are working with. And I think also that another priority for me, so it will be to find out how this role in particular can support the government's priorities in delivering for the people. But it will also be specifically my role as a resident coordinator and as the representative of the Secretary General is to ensure that Lesotho is also visible in the global multilateral system. So, showcasing the successes of Lesotho, making sure that there's space for Lesotho in those conversations and amplifying what we do here in support of the government in that global fora is very important. So that will also be one of the elements of my priorities, for sure.
The UN supports Lesotho's national agendas, development agenda across key pillars such as accountable governance, social cohesion, capital development, and inclusive economic growth. How do you assess the country's progress in these areas, and where do you see the most urgent gaps?
Well, again, I mean, I've only been in the country for 4 weeks, but what I can see from my engagement with partners and with the government in particular, from my conversations, is that, I would say governance is really moving in the right direction. The task in some ways has been completed with the 10th Amendment, and now it's really about implementation. So, the landmark achievement was to ensure that there is better accountability, that human rights are taken into consideration. And now it's really, I would say, building on that momentum and moving towards what the implementation means and of course, the 11th Amendment moving forward. The other thing I would say is that you have rights on paper. So if you look at gender-based violence, for example, the rights are on paper, but now they really need to become practice and reality. Mm-hmm. So there are significant gains, for example, around some of the legislation and around survivors' support in terms of violence. But, we still have 44% of women who experience gender-based violence. We have 17% of teenagers who become pregnant. And we also only have 23% of women who are in parliament. So to me, these are structural issues that need structural solutions. So we've made some gains, and again, we need to build on the momentum to make sure that by 2030, we get to the last mile, so to speak. I'm very, very impressed with Lesotho's health gains. The 95, 95, 95 targets of HIV is an exemplary success story of a situation where when we really, when there's sustained engagement on something, we have impact. And I think that's a great thing to celebrate for the country. But at the same time, we still have around 33% of stunting, and we have high maternal mortality rates. So it shows that we're on the right track, but the work is not done yet. Nutrition systems, health systems are interrelated and integrated, and we really need to work on them as a whole. And then finally, maybe just to say that I think that the big kind of unfinished business is economic growth, and I think that's a piece where the UN is 100%, of course, on these other issues as well, but 100% with the government in trying to figure out how to ensure better kind of economic transformation that brings the gap between employment and youth, for example, into a smaller margin. And so that's a piece where I think the most unfinished business still is as of today.
So Lesotho has experienced a recurrence of political instability in the past, and what are the roles that the UN play in peace building, political dialogues, and in institutional reforms to strengthen democracy and long-term stability?
Well, the first thing I would say is that peace and development are not separate agendas. They're the same agenda. They're the two sides of the same coin. Instability grows in spaces where people feel that there's inequality, where rights are not fulfilled, where there's a sense that there's no social mobility. And so development is really at the heart of stability and, of course, a stable democracy. From the UN side, we work in a catalytic way. So we help, we kind of move with the government and with the people in trying to figure out cycles of instability and how we get back on a track towards development or a pathway towards development. And in fact, the UN has played in this country, I think, a big role in that through the Peace Building Fund, through also supporting the national reforms. Agencies such as UNDP and OHCHR have been really incremental to this, important to this rather than incremental. But I also want to say that the UN in this space is a lot larger than just the country presence that we have here. So when the UN supports Lesotho, we support it with all of our system, which is also outside of Lesotho. So bringing in capacities, technical support to support the government and people around this area is really important. And of course, that's in part also my role as a resident coordinator. And that's really what the weight of the multilateral system has. It has technical, political, and financial support. The other thing I would say is that trust between a government and its people, or a state and its people, is not a given. It's built. Peace building is something that comes from the bottom up. And so we support a lot of inclusive processes where we try to enhance women's and youth participation in political processes. We work with communities in trying to ensure that there's better community security. So, for example, we are in the process of launching an app this week. In fact, the Lehokela app with the Ministry of Local Government, and that supports the Lesotho Mountain Police Service, and that app is helping to digitize community policing and kind of the entirety of crime reporting. So that's one very concrete thing that the UN is doing. And of course, then maybe finally just to say that the reform is not completed yet, and I think that that's one of the key pieces of how to anchor a stable and vibrant democracy. And of course, we know the government is very committed to this, and also from the UN side, this is something that we will continue to support in the years to come.
Talking about unemployment, the youth unemployment has been or remains significant threat to social cohesion, and that has been a case in the country. You might remember that last year, or since you said you have just arrived, maybe the Prime Minister just promised to create 70-something thousand jobs. So, but that's not the case. The case is, under your leadership, how will the UN support your empowerment, or youth empowerment, skills development, and job creation? What critical gaps still need to be addressed?
Well, actually, the UN is already working a lot in this space. So we support, for example, the Sebabatsa program. That's UNICEF, UNDP, and UNFPA, for example. UNDP has been particularly in the lead on that. We also have the YOMA, which is the Youth Agency Marketplace, which tries to match a digital space that matches youth and skills. And I think for us, it's about, it will be about scaling up, focusing and scaling up some of these interventions, and really kind of equipping the young Basotho with the skills that are needed for today's economy. And in some ways, the economy dictates what skills are needed, but we're working also to see, where we can really look at things like digital and green and interpreter skills. And I think that's kind of a piece around the UN support that's really, really important. And we aim to really drive this by aligning the skills with the marketplace. There's no point in doing skills development if it's not aligned with what the market can handle. The other thing I would say is that, education is, if it doesn't end with a job, it's going to be really difficult. And it's not just a certificate. It's a degree or a diploma that kind of leads to nothing, or it leads to you not being able to fulfill your full potential is not helpful. So, looking at things like how do we reform the TVET, how do we strengthen school to work transitions, how are we forging real private sector opportunities, how are we opening that space? I think initiatives like the UNDP led Unipod is really important. Turning young people into entrepreneurs, bringing innovation. But then similarly, if we innovate, we need to be sure that we are also ensuring that there is financing that backs that. So the UN also needs to work and support the government in looking at catalytic financing options. How do we make sure that youth have if you have a great idea, how are you able to then actually turn it into something that's bankable? How do you become bankable? How do you start saving and become part of that overall cycle? So these are some of the initial things. My sense is that youth unemployment it already is a big priority for the UN, but for me personally as well, I think youth unemployment will be something that I will definitely be focusing on in the next 4 years.
So, talking about climate change, which is increasingly affecting livelihoods, what water resources and agricultural productivity, how would you assess Lesotho's preparedness for climate shocks, and what more can be done, particularly with UN support, to strengthen adaptation and mitigation efforts?
So I think that actually there's a lot of progress already here that's been made in the last few years. And from the UN side, it's been agencies like FAO and WFP who have really been supporting that work as well. We have built the foundations. Lesotho has the foundations. You have an early warning systems, there are disaster frameworks, there are very clear climate commitments. But ultimately, the frameworks alone can't protect the country. So it needs to be anchored into actual adaptation measures, into prevention. So if we know, for example, that there's a cyclical drought, how are we prepared to ensure that early warning, what's in policy, actually becomes action on the ground. And so it moves on the preparedness side in particular. I think a lot of it needs to move from policy to actually working with people. The other thing I would say is that, water to me is not just a resource. It's really Lesotho's one of its greatest strategic assets. And I don't think that we can afford to treat water management as a routine. So we need to find ways of ensuring that communities have water, that is obviously the lifeline for agriculture, for water and sanitation, a lot of other things as well. And so, for example, elevating integrated water management into a national priority might be one avenue in terms of linking food security, clean energy, resilience. So using it as this kind of integrating principle. The green transition is, of course, not only an environmental obligation, but it's also an economic opportunity, because through green transition, you create new jobs. You can skill people, talking about how you skill youth to be able to actually work in a marketplace. UNDP is doing a lot of work around clean energy access in rural areas, for example, which I think there's some really great programmatic efforts that are being already pushed forward. So I think that's definitely one of the paths. But the UN support is not only programmatic. I think we also have a role in supporting the government in bringing the different pieces together. So thinking through, how do we facilitate better financing options? How do we access vertical funds? But then how do we bring partners in private sector to the table to really look at how we can push the energy transition forward? Then the last point I would maybe just make is that we need to stop being so reactionary. And this is not unique to Lesotho. This is I always say to people, for some reason, we like to invest in a crisis after it's happened. Prevention is always under-invested around the world. And figuring out ways of how we anticipate and invest in that preparedness actually will help us save more money in the long term. But for some reason, it's easier to react than anticipate. So I would say that's definitely a big piece.
Maybe last but not least, gender inequality and gender-based violence continue to be major concerns. What strategies do you believe are most effective in advancing gender equality and protecting women and girls in Lesotho?
I think I mentioned something earlier about how rights need to become reality.
Yes.
And I think that this is a really good example of that, where laws need to work for women and not just on paper. So Lesotho already has the legal tools, and now we need to find ways of delivering. If you look at, for example, the Counter Domestic Violence Act to Survivor Support Services, that legal framework is really there. And now we just need to find ways of enforcing those laws so that every woman who needs to find justice is able to do so. So I would say that that's probably the first point. Secondly, I think we are already quite far ahead in terms of how we talk about GBV. So in all of my meetings to date, pretty much GBV has come as one of the main issues that everyone wants to see a solution to. But we also need to change culture. So we can't just talk about GBV in terms of legislation. We can't only talk about GBV and how it affects women. We have to talk about what can men do more. Men and boys, schools, and leaders actively need to also be understanding GBV and really acting. It's not only an issue that is for women, it's an issue that is for society. And part of that sustained awareness is also making sure that girls stay in school, for example, and we're able to provide expansive reproductive health services. So everything is linked in that way. You can't take GBV out of a society. It's a core piece of the fabric, and we need to work on it as a holistic whole. I would say that. And then finally, economic freedom is also protection for women. So ensuring women have financial means, ensuring women have jobs, ensuring women have their rights, all of those things are really important as a protection measure and an empowerment measure, or also against GBV and vulnerability.
Lastly, what is the UN stance or comment on the ongoing fight in the Middle East that consequently affects a lot of people around the world?
Well, the Secretary General has been very clear in his stance from day one of the conflict, which has been to say that he condemns the violence, he condemns the strike by Americans in Israel, and he also condemns the strikes that Iran has done ever since to the neighboring countries. There's no way to consolidate peace except through dialogue and through a peace process, and that has been the Secretary General's and the UN's position from day one. What's happening to the civilians in that part of the world is really abhorrent. And there's a lot of concern in terms of how this conflict is at the precipice of evolving into something even larger. Obviously, here we've seen the economic impacts, as everyone has around the globe, on what that means. But then also just from a humanity perspective, he's been very clear in terms of the need to come to a diplomatic solution as soon as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.